Prime Minister and Minister for Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I thank all members who have spoken and supported the budget. Members have raised many suggestions. I won't be able to respond to all of them today. But I assure you that we have heard every suggestion and we will study them carefully. The detailed issues relating to specific programs and schemes will be addressed later at the COS debate. The questions raised by members during this debate revolve around three main issues. First, how are we supporting businesses and workers to navigate our new economic reality? Second, how are we helping Singaporeans to cope with the strains and stresses of life? And third, are we overly conservative in our fiscal projections and plans? Let me address these three issues in turn. First, how do we navigate a very uncertain global environment so we can continue to create good jobs and opportunities for Singaporeans? Quite a number of MPs spoke about this, including Ms. Foo Mee Har, Ms. Tin Pei Ling, Mr. Darrell David, Mr. Edward Chia, and Ms. Mariam Jaafar just now. Sir, the entire global system is changing. We can see it unfolding in real time before our eyes. The multilateral trading system has been weakened by growing protectionist sentiments and unilateral measures. Countries are focusing more about their own defense and security interests, so it's become more about zero-sum competition rather than win-win cooperation. And all this will disadvantage small and open economies like Singapore. The major powers say they don't want to fight, they don't want conflict, but they are all preparing for conflict. And all of them realize that there is a need for a strong industrial base to sustain any war effort. In particular, the Western countries feel that they are at a disadvantage, and it's not difficult to see why. 20 years ago, China accounted for just 9% of global manufacturing output. Now, it accounts for 1/3 of global manufacturing output. That's more than the next three countries, US, Germany, Japan, put together, China alone. So naturally, there's a huge attempt to rebuild manufacturing in America and Europe. And that's why competition for investments will only intensify. So we have to be prepared for tougher competition and do what we can to stay in the game. We are topping up the National Productivity Fund, which will provide us extra firepower to stay competitive and attract investments. We are taking steps to strengthen our infrastructure, enhance our enterprise ecosystem, as well as our innovation and technology engines. And these moves will translate eventually and ultimately to better jobs and better opportunities for all Singaporeans. We also have to brace ourselves for increased scrutiny of high-tech activities done out of Singapore, something which we discussed in Parliament last week and which several members also highlighted. We are an open hub. We welcome and harness technology from different countries. But the key countries, the key sources of technology, are now concerned about technology leakage. They want to keep their proprietary technologies controlled tightly within a safe ecosystem. To be clear, we do not enforce the unilateral export controls imposed by any single country. But we will make efforts to address these concerns. We will lean forward and provide assistance where appropriate in accordance with our laws. And members may have read in the media today some actions we have taken. We make these proactive moves because we want to ensure Singapore remains a reliable and trusted partner in global trade and commerce. In today's fragmented world, we must work even harder to stay open as a hub where businesses from all over the world can operate with assurance and confidence. As we navigate these external challenges, we also must continue to press on with productivity improvements in our own economy. Our labor productivity has been growing at around 2% per annum over the past decade, from 2014 to 2024. Most of this is driven by the outward-oriented sectors of our economy. So we can still do better to improve productivity for our domestic-oriented sectors. I know many SMEs are concerned about the high cost of doing business, and several members, including SMS Desmond Tan, Mr. Mark Lee, and Mr. Lim Biao Chuan, reflected these concerns. But there are economic realities we cannot avoid. Our land cost reflects its scarcity in our small island nation. And as long as Singapore does well and there is strong demand for land, there will be upward pressure on land prices. Our energy costs are affected by global price levels. We import our energy and we have limited renewable energy options. Our labor cost reflects the wages of Singaporean workers, and we all want wages to rise. But wage increases have to be matched by productivity gains. Associate Professor James Lim highlighted that wage increases in recent years have lagged productivity growth, and there's scope for wages to go up further. But we should be looking at the data over a longer time frame. And over the past decade, real wage growth has been commensurate with productivity growth. And we will continue to push for this, to push for higher productivity as well as higher wages. That's why we opted for the progressive wage model, which ensures continued skills upgrading for workers as they move up the wage ladder. We will also keep an eye on costs and provide short-term help to companies where needed, but without blunting the incentive for them to restructure. And that's why we have corporate income tax rebates in this budget, and we are increasing co-funding levels for the progressive wage credit scheme to help companies co-pay the wage increases for lower wage workers. We are also supporting companies on the regulatory front. DPM Gan Kim Yong is leading the Inter-Ministerial Committee for Pro-Enterprise Rules Review to review our regulatory processes and cut compliance costs. And he will give an update on this work at MTI COS. Our more important effort is really to help companies consolidate, restructure, and transform. That's something the government can encourage, facilitate, and nudge, but in the end, the business owners themselves, the companies themselves must be prepared to make the change. Take retail as an example. Some retailers are concerned about the impact of the Johor-Singapore SEZ and the RTS link. But with e-commerce, competition is already happening, and it's happening and taking place from all over the world. Today, Singapore consumers, all of us, can already purchase many items from abroad and have them shipped to our doorsteps at cheaper prices than the local retail price. There are many examples you can look for yourself. So retailers have to adapt and rethink their business models. Some have done so successfully. Take the example of baking supplies company Phoon Huat. It started out in 1947 as a single shop in Middle Road. But with continuous transformation, it has expanded its operations significantly. It now has its own production facility, a distribution center, and 20 retail stores in Singapore. And with support from Enterprise Singapore, it has built a thriving e-commerce platform which enables the company to export to more than 20 countries. It has also adapted to changing consumer preferences, for example, by launching its own gourmet brand, refreshing its brick-and-mortar stores to provide experiential spaces for baking demonstrations and classes. So this is how constant innovation and transformation can allow businesses to stay competitive and relevant. It's not easy to make such transformations, but for firms that are willing to do so, the government will provide our full support. Mr. Derek Goh asked about the kind of support that's available. In fact, we have many schemes to help our SMEs. In this budget, I've highlighted 3 new initiatives: the Skills Future Workforce Development Grant, the refreshed Skills Future Enterprise Credit, and the Enterprise Compute Initiative. These new initiatives arose out of our engagements with the trade associations and chambers, the TACs, and the Singapore Business Federation. We continue to welcome their feedback and their important work in getting their members to transform their businesses. At the same time, aside from the new initiatives, there are many existing initiatives for SMEs that remain part of our overall enterprise support efforts. And for firms that fully utilize the support schemes, the total amount of help that they can get is in fact considerable. In the past, the utilization of many of our enterprise schemes has tended to be lower than what we had projected or hoped for. We have been discussing with the TACs to find out why, so that we can raise awareness amongst the SMEs and also do what we can to make the schemes more accessible. We hope the latest budget moves will help. And if the utilization of these schemes turns out to be higher than expected and more funding is required, I assure you the Ministry of Finance will be happy to provide additional resources. Besides uplifting the overall SME sector, we are also developing a pipeline of promising enterprises, some of which will eventually grow to become global companies of the future. The MNEs we attract to Singapore support this enterprise development strategy because the smaller firms can partner with the MNEs and eventually expand to new markets abroad. And as Mr. Neil Parekh highlighted, such partnerships are beneficial and we will continue to create more opportunities for collaboration. Some enterprises are started by global entrepreneurs or founders from abroad who are keen to use Singapore as a launchpad. And we welcome more of them to come here and to launch their next big idea here. There are also more homegrown companies emerging from our R&D ecosystem, which Mr. DPM Heng mentioned yesterday, and more young Singaporeans now prepared to take the plunge into entrepreneurship. So on the whole, if you look at our enterprise ecosystem today compared to 15 years ago, I would say things have improved considerably. But there's still much more that needs to be done, and we will press on with our efforts. With constant industry transformation, we can expect more churn in workplaces. Existing jobs will be redesigned and new jobs will be created. Understandably, all this will contribute to anxiety and concerns among Singaporeans about jobs. Several members, like Ms. Cheryl Chan, Mr. Faisal Manap spoke about this, and Ms. Denise Pua and Ms. Jessica Tan also highlighted the disruptions that could be posed by rapid technological advances. These concerns are real, and I acknowledge them. But we have to understand the underlying reasons and avoid pinning the blame on foreigners, because we can see this happening in so many other countries, where foreigners are blamed and the public discourse ends up spiraling into very negative, very toxic, and xenophobic directions. That's not what we stand for in Singapore, and we must never allow that to happen here. Our approach towards foreign workers is clear. We welcome them to work here, but we do this in a controlled manner and ensure that they complement Singaporeans. And we have continued to fine-tune over time our system of controls. For example, we've introduced a compass framework for employment passes. We've introduced new measures like the Workplace Fairness Act to protect Singaporeans against workplace discrimination. And this approach has contributed to positive outcomes, including low overall unemployment rates, good employment outcomes, and rising real incomes for Singaporeans. But we are not resting on our laurels. The government will do more to better support Singaporeans, young and old, to better equip everyone for the changes in our economy. That's exactly why we are taking decisive steps to strengthen SkillsFuture. It has been 10 years since we started, as some of you highlighted. We've made several significant changes. SMS Desmond Tan and others highlighted this too. We've introduced the SkillsFuture Level Up program for mid-career workers and the SkillsFuture Job Seeker Support Scheme to support those who are involuntarily unemployed and need help to get back to work. In this budget, we are making further moves, including to nurture more promising Singaporean corporate leaders, and we will do more Several members also spoke about this, including Ms. Cheryl Chan, about a talent development strategy. We want to develop Singaporean talent, and we want to see more Singaporeans take on leadership positions in the corporate sector. We are also supporting in this budget senior worker employment. That's something close to the heart of many Labour MPs, and many of you spoke about this passionately, as SMS Heng Chee Hao, Mr. Patrick Tay, Mr. Muhammad Fahmi. We are convening the tripartite work group to dive deeper. There will be many issues to work through, and I look forward to making progress with all of them with our tripartite partners. So while we have made progress on Skills Future, we know that there's still much more to be done, because you can compare our adult education and training system with all the investments and established infrastructure we have in the formal schooling years. There's still so much to do to fully build up our Skills Future system. This is not just in Singapore. You look around the world in countries everywhere. Generally, governments have invested more in pre-employment training than in adult education and training. But compared to other countries, in fact, Singapore is already at the forefront in many respects. So there are no ready models for us to look to. We have to experiment, innovate, and find our own way forward. But we are fully committed to this endeavor, and I expect to put in additional resources in the coming years to further strengthen Skills Future. So we cannot save every job, but we will support every worker in Singapore. We will create even more opportunities and better jobs for all Singaporeans. This leads to the second issue, which is how is the government providing support to help Singaporeans cope with the stresses and strains in life? Mr. Pritam Singh, the leader of the opposition, and Mr. Leong Man Wai said the GST increase has made it worse by adding to inflation. In fact, Mr. Singh said the GST increase turbocharged inflation. But let's be clear, as a small and open economy, our inflation was driven primarily by global factors: wars, supply chain disruptions, and rising energy costs. As Mr. Saktiandi Supat noted, even before the GST increase, prices were already going up globally and in Singapore. And here in Singapore, the central bank MAS had assessed that the effect of the GST increase on inflation would be transitory. Indeed, that was the case. In 2022, CPI inflation was 6.1%, 2022. Then, the GST went up by 1 percentage point on 1st Jan 2023, and another 1 percentage point on 1st Jan 2024. What happened to CPI inflation? It moderated to 4.8% in 2023 and came down further to 2.4% in 2024. Where is the turbocharging? Look, I know elections are approaching, but this chamber is not an election rally. Let's not get carried away by hyperbole and have a debate based on facts. The fact is inflation has eased, both globally and in Singapore. But people are still concerned about cost pressures. It's not unique to us. It's felt across many other advanced economies, where the headline economic indicators are positive, but sentiments are poor. In the US, they even coined a name for it. They call it vibe session. But there is a reason for the negative vibes. It's not just about feelings and sentiment. It's because price levels remain high, even though inflation has eased. And these create real pressures. And it takes time for people to adjust to these new price realities. We understand these concerns, and that's why we are continuing to provide temporary help measures through the CDC vouchers and other measures. And for the one-off SG60 surplus sharing package, we decided that the key plank would also be in the form of vouchers so that it can provide some relief on the cost front. As I said in my budget statement, we will continue to provide cost of living support for as long as needed and within our means. The Workers' Party and the Progress Singapore Party appear to be unhappy and displeased that the government is providing vouchers to help Singaporeans with the cost of living. They suggest that the government is relying solely on vouchers to help with the cost of living, but we've never said that. These are temporary help measures. They are not long-term solutions. In fact, they only make up a small part of our overall budget. The cost of living measures and the SG60 package account for about 5% of our budget. A much larger part of our spending is in structural programs, especially to equip and empower Singaporeans through education, skills training, skills upgrading, job training, and the significant moves we are making on Skills Future, which I highlighted just now. All this will ensure Singaporeans do not just receive help, but are able to stand on their own feet and seize better opportunities for themselves and thrive in a rapidly changing world. As we have repeatedly emphasized, the more durable, the more sustainable way to tackle cost of living is to ensure that Singaporeans enjoy higher real incomes. And that must be supported by a strong economy and productivity gains. That remains the key thrust of our approach. And objectively speaking, we have done relatively well. Singaporean households across different income levels have experienced sustained real income growth over the past decade. And what we have achieved has outperformed many other advanced economies, as you can see from this chart. I show these statistics not to blow our own trumpet, but so we know what the facts are and how we compare with others. But I fully recognize that even with a strong and growing economy, the day-to-day lived realities for Singaporeans may be different. Life in a compact city like Singapore with no hinterland can be competitive and it can be stressful, something which members on both sides of the House were quick to bring up in their speeches over the last 2 days. And that's exactly why, as part of Forward Singapore, we've been taking steps to strengthen our social support system. We want to provide greater assurance to Singaporeans across every life stage on their basic needs like education, retirement, healthcare, and housing. We want to provide more support for the disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. We want to ensure that no one is left to fend for themselves in Singapore. And if anyone faces setbacks, we have a system in place to help them recover and bounce back stronger. These are desired outcomes which I'm sure we can all agree to. The question is, how do we achieve them? And members have offered many suggestions. Ms. Hazel Phua said we need to put more emphasis on social rather than economic considerations, and that we are overly reliant on the price mechanism, citing land as an example. But pricing all resources properly is not about giving more weight to economic over social considerations. It's simply about getting our policies right and doing things the right way. If we don't price properly, then we are giving a hidden subsidy. A subsidy means someone has to pay. If it's not paid by consumers, it's paid by taxpayers. If it's not paid today, it will have to be paid tomorrow. Because at the end of the day, there is no free lunch. So our approach must be to get the price right, then we decide how much to subsidize. Take public housing as an example. HDB has to pay the market price for the land when it develops a new flat. But when it prices a new flat for sale, it doesn't recover fully the cost of the flat. Instead, it prices it on the basis of affordability, as we have said time and again. I'll give you a concrete example. A 4-room BTO flat in Sengkang. This was in the October 2024 BTO exercise. After accounting for grants, a resale flat nearby in that area is around $545,000. 5 years ago, it was about $360,000. So resale prices have gone up nearly $200,000. What about the sales price by HDB for the new flat? The BTO price has not gone up by that much. Instead, it has increased in line with median income over that period and was sold at about $370,000. So resale prices have gone up a lot. BTO, yes, but not as much and in line with median incomes. The difference is a subsidy that's borne by the government. That, together with the higher cost of construction, is one of the key reasons why HDB's deficit has increased sharply. If you look at its annual statements in FY 2018, the deficit was $2 billion. Now, in FY 2023, it's $6.8 billion. And the government's funding to HDB to cover its deficit has correspondingly increased over the years to cover the deficit. Some of you may ask, and it is the right question to ask, is this sustainable? It will not be sustainable if overall property prices keep rising faster than incomes and the financing gap keeps growing year after year. But this will not happen because we keep a close watch over the property market and we ensure it does not happen. That's why we have introduced cooling measures where necessary by increasing the ABSD for multiple property and foreigner purchases. And we have significantly increased BTO supply as well as government land sales to make up for the disruption that occurred during COVID. And these measures have helped and will eventually stabilize the market. More specifically, when you look at the HDB market, in the short term, resale prices can be up, they can be down. In localized popular areas, they would generally be higher than the less popular areas. And that's why we introduced a new classification system with the plus and prime flats. But overall, in the longer term, we are confident that HDB prices will remain affordable. Why? Because only Singaporeans can buy HDB flats. And we can, and we will build enough housing for every Singaporean household. For now, we have focused on ensuring that the new flats are available for first-timers, especially young married couples and parents with young children. And we are already seeing concrete improvements. The application rate for first-timer families across all flat types has stabilized. In fact, it's come down from 3.7 times in 2019 to 2.1 times in 2024. This is the application rate. So application rates are now below pre-COVID levels. And with a sustained and robust supply of new flats, and as the overall market stabilizes, we will have scope to consider how to adjust our policies to meet the needs of other groups, including second-timers and singles. There have also been calls for us, for the government, to make bolder moves on social policies. And you can look around the world. There are many examples of social support arrangements that started with the best of intentions, but only ended up with more problems. For example, some promised sizable pension payments funded by younger generations, but now have problems paying for them. Others offer free universal health care, but now face rising costs and an overburdened healthcare system. To be clear, this is not about government spending. We are prepared to spend more where necessary. But it's equally, if not more important, to get the policies right and to ensure the overall system is fiscally sound and sustainable. And on that basis, we've been taking steps to progressively strengthen the key pillars of our social system and our social compact. We started in Singapore with the basics, universal access to primary school for education, CPF for retirement, government subsidies and the 3Ms for healthcare, and HDB for housing. And we've progressively enhanced these pillars. We've got workfare for lower wage workers, silver support for the more vulnerable seniors, and skills future to support all our workers. Take retirement as one example. Our CPF system will be 70 years this year. In a time when many pension systems are struggling with sustainability, we continue to provide assurance for Singaporeans' retirement adequacy in a sustainable manner. At its core, the CPF enables Singaporeans to save for their own retirement with support from their employers. But we don't just leave these to individuals alone. Families are encouraged to help their loved ones save more, and we provide avenues for them to do so with matching grants from the government. The government provides risk-free interest rates with extra interest for lower balances to boost savings. We support lower-wage workers to earn more and save more through workfare and progressive wages. And for seniors who had lower incomes during their working years and so less in retirement, we have silver support to cover them. So these improvements have been made to CPF over the years. And more recently, when we looked at the data, we saw the need to do more for two groups. First, ITE graduates whose wage trajectories were not rising fast enough compared to their peers in polytechnics and universities. And second, young seniors in their 50s and early 60s who could use more support for their retirement. And that's why we introduced the ITE Progression Award last year, which will support ITE graduates to pursue a diploma and provide a top-up to their CPF accounts when they complete their diploma studies. And we also introduced a substantial Majula package for young seniors, which included the one-time retirement savings bonus, the MediSave bonus, as well as an ongoing earn and save bonus. Several members, in particular Mr. Louis Chua, Mr. Saktiandi Supat, spoke at length about retirement adequacy. I've listened to them carefully, and we will consider all your views and suggestions. On the recommendations of the CPF advisory panel, many have in fact already been taken up. There are now various low-cost funds included under the CPF investment scheme, which members can choose to invest in. The question is whether there is scope for a low-cost life cycle fund done in a more comprehensive and structured way, beyond just leaving CPF members to choose for themselves. Because these options exist, they can choose, but whether there's scope to do it in a more structured way. Now, if we were to do that, that fund must be able to earn better returns than the prevailing SA rate, the special account rate, not the OA rate. And that is 4% on a risk-free basis and up to 6% based on the extra interest. Actually, that's not so easy to beat. On a consistent basis, sure, you can opt to take more risk for higher returns. Mr. Chua mentioned an 80-20 portfolio promising above 7% returns. But that's, I think he qualified potential returns. If you are lucky, you may get 7% or more. What happens if you are not so lucky? What happens if you retire at the time of market downturn? How do we provide assurance to Singaporeans? So these are issues we will have to consider carefully, but we will certainly continue to review, fine-tune, and improve the CPF system to better meet the needs of our seniors and to prepare for a future with increased longevity and life expectancy. This same approach applies to other areas too, which many members spoke about. For example, many MPs, Mr. Vikram Nair, Associate Professor Razwana Begum, Ms. Hanny So, Mr. Alex Yam, Ms. Nadia Samdin, Mr. Louis Ng, Ms. Carrie Tan, amongst others, spoke about more support for families. And support not just in financial terms, but leave arrangements was a popular refrain from the speeches. We will have to look at all of these suggestions. Others like Ms. Denise Phua, Mr. Don Wee, Mr. Ang Wei Neng, Mr. Sharel Taha have highlighted the need for more inclusive hiring practices and employment support for persons with disabilities. I agree we must do more for people with disabilities, and in my budget statement, I said we are embarking on a comprehensive study to look at post-18 pathways for people with disabilities, and we will want to do more for them. Many members like SPS Eric Chua, Mr. Henry Kwek, Mr. Sia Yao Tran, Mr. Dennis Tan also spoke about the need to help our seniors age well and ensure they are not left behind in their silver years. In fact, we have made significant moves over the past 1 to 2 years to support these groups, including in this budget. But our attitude is we are never satisfied with the status quo, and we will continue to review and study how we can make things better. Likewise, on the subject of caregivers, which many members spoke about too, including Mr. Yip Hon Wing, Mr. Ang Wei Neng, Mr. Sharil Taha, Ms. Ng Ling Ling, Ms. Joan Pereira, Dr. Tan Wu Ming. Caregiving arrangements vary from family to family. Some have sole caregivers, while others will share the responsibility over several family members. We recognize the crucial role that caregivers play and the sacrifices they make, such as leaving employment to care for family arrangements or foregoing their careers in order to spend more time to take care of their family members. We want to provide support for those who have to take up this role, as it is not easy for them. It is difficult to put a monetary value on caregiving. And furthermore, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to support caregivers. So our approach has been to provide support for the family as a whole. And in this budget, we have significantly enhanced a home caregiving grant and increased subsidies for care services in nursing homes and in the community. But this is not the end of our move. In fact, we will study more to see how we can further strengthen our support for caregivers. Members also had suggestions covering different areas. Mr. Dennis Tan, Ms. Jessica Tan, Mr. Siet Yao Tran had suggestions on means testing. This is something we grapple with all the time because there is no perfect means testing criteria. Even on incomes, you can decide per capita household income, family income, but we don't have the data, lifelong earnings income, a whole range of criteria to use. And we know that increasingly it's not just about incomes as a means test, but also wealth. And several MPs spoke about wealth inequalities. Then you have to look at wealth measures. And how do you look at that? What measures do you use? And that's why we have AV as a proxy. So these are issues we will continue to fine-tune in terms of the means testing criteria. Ms. Jin Si, Ms. Yo Wan Ling, Mr. Gan Tiam Po highlighted other groups that may need more support, like freelance and agency workers, as well as working mothers. Ms. Usha Chandradas earlier championed for the arts. Mr. Ong Hua Han reminded us to ensure our art and sports scene remains inclusive. And Dr. Wan Rizal and Ms. Rachel Ong advocated for mental health issues. These are some of the key points that members have raised. We keep an open mind and we study all your suggestions carefully. And beyond ideas shared in this House, we continue to engage widely and hear views from all Singaporeans. We do so through various participatory platforms, something which Ms. Herting-Rue talked about, like citizen panels, youth panels, and alliances for action. These platforms are resource-intensive. They take a lot of time, but we find them useful, and we will plan to do more. We may not be able to implement every idea. There will be differences of views, and if we can't implement for whatever reason, we will explain why. Our commitment, the government's commitment, is that we will do whatever is necessary to ensure that every Singaporean feels supported at every life stage. And the numbers, what we spend on, reflects this commitment. In fact, we spend more on social development than on the economy and security. Actually, social spending is already greater than what we spend on both the economy and security combined. So we are not just saying we will do, we have done so in concrete terms. And we expect social spending to continue to grow in the coming years. It's partly driven by our aging population and rising healthcare costs. It's also because of our efforts under Forward Singapore to strengthen our social compact. We have fleshed out many programs in this budget and the previous one, but as I said, there will be more to come as this is a multi-year effort. Ultimately, a strong social support system should not be reliant on the government alone, even though the government is going to do more, but it cannot be reliant on the government alone. We will do more, but our actions must also be complemented by individual and community responsibility. And we are very fortunate to have charities and social service agencies doing excellent work on the ground. We appreciate and thank all of them. In this budget, we are supporting them further with more matching grants for their fundraising efforts, something which Mr. Melvin Yong and Mr. Keith Chua welcome. And we will continue to work with all of them as partners to uplift our fellow Singaporeans. I should also add that many of the issues we are dealing with requires changes, not just in policies, but also in our attitudes and mindsets. The government will spend more on healthcare, but Singaporeans also have to do their part to stay active and maintain a healthy lifestyle. The government has and will continue to invest in skills future, but Singaporeans must want to improve their skills, and businesses must give their workers the time and space to go for training. And that's why Forward Singapore is about strengthening our social compact. It's about our shared responsibility, how we support one another, care for those in need, and lift each other up. That's how we build a more inclusive and a stronger and more united Singapore. Finally, on the third issue, are we overly conservative in our fiscal projections and plans, especially in light of our surplus position? Mr. Liang Eng Hua asked about the treatment of Singer and how it contributed to the surplus. Under Singer, we borrow for major and long-term infrastructure projects. The spending for such projects is capitalized, which allows us to spread the expenses across the useful life of the asset. This, as we have explained, is more equitable as the asset will benefit both current and future generations. This accounting treatment has been in place since financial year 2021. Dr. Lim Wee Kiang asked about the assets linked to the $3 billion money laundering case, which have been surrendered to the state. These assets are progressively being liquidated, and when they are liquidated, monies will be added to the consolidated fund. These funds are not earmarked for specific purposes, but will be part of our overall revenues to fund the government's budget. Several members, including Mr. Singh, the leader of the opposition, Ms. Hazel Phua, and Mr. Leong Man Wai, questioned the need to increase the GST given our strong fiscal position. I should remind members that we are in this strong fiscal position precisely because the government took the necessary steps early in this term to raise revenues. But if we were to rewind the clock and consider our situation, imagine what our situation was at the beginning of this decade. We were in the thick of battle, fighting COVID. I know it feels like a bad dream and a distant memory to all of us, but those were truly tough times. In 2020 alone, we had 5 budgets. In 2021, we had 3 budgets. We sought the President's approval 5 times to draw from past reserves. And this is 2020, 2021. We had no way of knowing when the pandemic would end, how the virus would mutate, how many more new waves of infection would we face, how many more restrictions we have to impose, and how much deeper a fiscal hole we would end up with. But we already knew for sure that spending needs would rise over the horizon. It was coming. Year after year, we could see it happening. Healthcare spending was rising, especially with our rapidly aging population. We looked at different ways to raise revenues, including through property and income taxes, but these moves were still not enough to cover the expected increase in expenditure, which was sure to happen. So what should we do to plug the funding gap? That's why we had to consider the GST increase. It was a difficult decision. It was a difficult choice. It's never easy to raise taxes, and certainly not a tax like the GST. But governance is about making responsible choices, not just popular ones. We must ask ourselves, do we want short-term populism or long-term stability? Do we want to kick the can down the road or take the hard but necessary decisions? So once there were signs that the economy had stabilized, we decided to proceed with the GST increase. But we also rolled out a comprehensive assurance package, which effectively delayed the GST increase for the vast majority of Singaporean households. Essentially, once we decided to move, the GST rates were locked in. But with the assurance package, we could be more responsive to changing circumstances, and we could push back effectively the impact of the GST increase. And that's exactly what we did. We had multiple rounds of enhancements to the assurance package to tackle cost of living concerns and to ensure that the majority of households will not feel the impact of the additional GST for at least 5 years. At the same time, we have a permanent GST voucher, which we also enhanced. And this ensures that the GST and the GST voucher scheme combined together will support the lower income groups and will protect them, not just over the next 5 or 10 years, but on a permanent and ongoing basis. So with that in place, together with the other revenues we made, we are in a better position now. And now the additional GST revenues have started to come in. And it's mostly, the revenues are mostly from those who are better off, foreigners as well as tourists. And it will give us the resources we need to improve our healthcare infrastructure and take better care of our seniors. What would have happened if we chose to avoid the GST increase because it is unpopular? Or if we did not enjoy the unexpected upsides in corporate income tax collections, which emerged only in the last 2 years? We would have ended financial year 2024 on a deficit. The projected balance in FY 2025 would also have been a deficit. And that would have meant less funding for essential services, less support for our seniors, and fewer resources to invest in our future. Basically, Singapore and Singaporeans would have ended up in a much weaker position. Several members I know criticized MOF's fiscal marksmanship. Look, when I started work in MOF decades ago, one of my main tasks was to provide fiscal projections. As an economist, that was what I did. I was one of those who would run the models and churn out the figures. So I know exactly what this work entails and how difficult it is. I will not defend the figures if they are off the mark, but I will speak up for our MOF officers who do this work with dedication and professionalism against any unfair criticisms. Ultimately, a budget is a projection. It is based on the best available information at that point in time. We have to plan ahead. We have to make assumptions, and we have to decide how we deal with uncertainties. In a crisis, when there's greater volatility in the economy, it is inherently more difficult to predict the turning points. But if you set aside unexpected crises like COVID, our operating revenue projections have generally not been far off the mark. The average deviation over the 10-year period from FY 2010 to FY 2019 was within a reasonable range of 5%. In the last 2 financial years, 2023, 2024, the deviation has been larger, but still around 7%, which is comparable still to other jurisdictions like the UK and the Netherlands. Let's dive deeper into the FY 2024 projections because there were some questions raised about them. Mr. Louis Chua had filed a written PQ in September asking about the overall fiscal position. Our reply referred to the figure reported in the budget book, which was also the figure provided in the budget statement. In fact, MOF only starts to put together the revised fiscal estimates around the December and January period, when we start to get more data to update our estimates. And as I explained in the budget statement, one key reason for the revenue upside was the unexpected increase in corporate income tax collections. Another reason, more generally, is that our economy performed better than expected. the Singapore economy. Remember, in 2024, early 2024, MPI started the year projecting that the economy would grow at 1 to 3%. We ended 2024 with GDP growth of 4.4%, well exceeding our expectations. But it's not just us, it's also the forecast of many, in fact, I would say virtually all private sector professional economists. So when you have higher growth, it means higher incomes, which drives consumption, and that shows up in higher collections for GST, for example, and COE. Now, Ms. Sylvia Lim suggested that the COE collections were driven by government policy, which kept prices high, but in fact, it was the opposite effect. The higher collections were a result of government action by injecting additional COE quota. This helped to bring prices down by 10 to 30% from the peaks in October 2023. But it also meant more motor vehicle sales. And then with more sales, more quantity purchased, that's why you have more revenues. So it's not a price effect, it's a quantity effect. In most other countries, poor budget marksmanship is when a government severely overestimates the revenue it will collect and underestimates its expenditure. That's what poor marksmanship is about. Then the government makes unfunded promises that it cannot see through because there's no money, or it borrows funds from somewhere else and kicks the can down the road, leaves behind a growing burden for the next generation. But this is not the case in Singapore, where we practice responsible and prudent budgeting. Ultimately, it's not just a matter of good marksmanship or poor marksmanship. It's a question of the right values and the wrong values, the correct fiscal principles and the wrong fiscal principles. And the WP and the PSP may think that we are being overly cautious in our projections, but this government will never take risk with Singaporeans' lives and future. We keep our public finances healthy year after year. We spend within our means, and if there are new or additional areas of need, we raise revenues to meet these new demands. We always ensure that we have enough rather than risk falling behind and falling short. And should we have surpluses, that's good news. The money is not squandered because it helps to fund future needs and allows us to provide more support for Singaporeans. And the fruits of Singapore's progress will be shared with everyone, as we are doing in this budget, to recognize the collective efforts of all Singaporeans. So that's the responsible way to steward and manage our nation's finances. We have 60 years of history to show that Singapore has abided by the right values and principles, and Singaporeans can continue to count on this government to continue doing the same. We are in a fortunate position to have surpluses in FY 2024 and FY 2025. But on the expenditure side, I fully expect our spending to increase in the coming years. Mr. Leong commented that the monies are going into more and more endowment and trust funds. But in fact, the majority of these funds are drawdown funds. In other words, the monies within these funds are going to be withdrawn and spent for upcoming needs. Take, for example, Changi Airport. The monies that we set aside will be spent very soon as construction on Terminal 5 begins this year. Changi Airport is owned by the Changi Airport Group, or CAG. It's not directly by the government. And so the T5 project is not eligible for Singa borrowing. Instead, CAG will borrow for the project, and the government will be providing a guarantee to help lower borrowing costs, as I explained in my budget statement. But if we want Changi Airport to remain competitive as a global air hub, CAG cannot rely on borrowing alone to cover the full cost of the project. And that's why the government is providing significant support and funding through grants. Even as our spending goes up, we will continue to keep within our means and maintain a balanced budget over the medium term. And that's why I don't see us being able to put back the amount we had drawn from past reserves during COVID, something which Ms. Tin Pei-Ling asked about. But we will continue to be responsible and prudent with our finances. And if we maintain this approach, our reserves should be able to keep pace with our economy, and we can continue to benefit from a steady stream of NIRC in our revenue stream. Compare this with the fiscal situation in so many other advanced economies around the world, especially in the West. They are running record levels of fiscal deficits, and their national debts are growing faster than their economy. So the fiscal space they have to sustain their higher levels of welfare while continuing to invest in defense and economy is shrinking. And at some point, the reckoning will come. You don't even have to go further, far afield to look at Western countries. Look nearer to home and what's happening in Hong Kong, which several members also talked about. It used to have a healthy fiscal position, but look how quickly the situation can turn and how they are grappling with deficits now and have to take such drastic steps to consolidate their position. So really, we should appreciate all that we have here in Singapore. In contrast to so many other countries which are using their revenues to service interest payments, we have the opposite. We receive a boost to our revenues from our investment returns. Just think about it. Countries that have this luxury of investment returns are the ones that are endowed with oil and gas or some other natural resources. They have been blessed by the heavens with these endowments. We have nothing, and yet we are in this position. It is truly unique, and it is a Singapore miracle. Our fiscal strength is a vital source of competitive advantage in these turbulent times. It's going to get worse. The ride ahead will be bumpier. There are dark clouds over the horizon. No one can predict what the next few years will bring, but the risks have risen sharply. We have already seen wars in Europe and the Middle East. We may yet see conflict in Asia. We have to be prepared for a whole spectrum of possible global disruptions and threats. And in today's environment, sadly, global responses to these threats may not be as well coordinated and effective as before. But in Singapore, we know that if such shocks were to arise, we have the ability to respond swiftly to them, like we did during COVID. Our reserves and our fiscal strength will enable us to protect Singaporeans when it matters and to turn adversity into opportunity, to turn our vulnerabilities into strength. Sir, our system has also enabled us to achieve good and equitable outcomes. The government will continue to focus on accountability in spending to ensure value for money in everything we spend. And there are existing mechanisms in place to scrutinize our spending plans. I won't go through all of them, but we have well-established mechanisms to do so. The government continues to put out regular reporting of outcomes in the Singapore Public Sector Outcomes Review, as well as KPIs in the budget book. And as Mr. Singh himself noted, we have put out occasional papers wherever relevant. For example, MOF's occasional paper on our COVID measures, our occasional paper on medium-term projections, which I said we will be updating, as well as MTI's report card on the ITMs. So we will continue to do so wherever useful. On the whole, we have achieved outcomes that reflect our values as a society, one that's fair and equitable, prudent yet progressive, where those who have more contribute more to uplift those with less. In this budget, we did extend some measures to private property residents, arising from feedback from the residents themselves, as well as from many members. Mr. Singh says it is ironic that they should receive climate vouchers. But why is that so? This is not the cost of living support. It's an effort to encourage everyone to do their part to be more energy efficient. But more importantly, let's look at the overall picture. We continue to have a highly progressive tax and transfer system. Members are familiar with the benefits and tax ratios which we highlight every budget, and it's worth going through them again. The bottom quintile of households receives $4 in benefits for every dollar of tax paid. Middle-income households also get more benefits than tax paid as you go through the income thresholds and levels. In fact, it's only the top quintile of income earners who receives less in benefits, or 30 cents for every dollar of tax paid. So this is what our system has achieved, and these outcomes are a culmination of years of deliberate moves to enhance the progressivity of our overall taxes and transfers system. There is no fiscal system in the world that can deliver perfect precision and equity. But I think we have found an approach in Singapore that works for us. It's not perfect, but we continue to make it better. Here, everyone contributes to taxes. The lower and middle income will receive more support, while the higher income and wealthier segments of the population will contribute more. It's a fair and progressive tax and redistribution system anchored on our values of a fair and just society. And the strength of our fiscal system is internationally recognized. A recent OECD report commended Singapore on our robust fiscal system. This is hard-earned credibility that we have built up over many, many decades. It's not something we should take for granted, because that same credibility can be quickly destroyed in the wrong hands. And so at the end of the day, on something as fundamental as this, Singaporeans will decide. Will they prefer a government that underestimates our needs, spends more from our hard-earned reserves, and leaves us weaker? Or will Singaporeans prefer a government that steadfastly upholds fiscal responsibility and discipline and ensures we have enough resources for current and future generations to handle unexpected challenges? Sir, the PAP's approach is clear. We take our duty as stewards of the country seriously. We remain true to our mission and manage our finances carefully for the benefit of all Singaporeans now and in the future. We will continue to do our best to convince Singaporeans that ours is the right approach. It has served us well these last 60 years, and it will continue to keep Singapore on the right track in the years ahead. Mr. Speaker, to conclude, the world is going through unprecedented changes. We are contending with tectonic shifts on multiple fronts: geopolitics and trade, technology and energy, demographics and culture. Thriving amidst adversity is never easy, but that's what the Singapore story is all about from the very beginning. And we have strong foundations today that give us confidence to move forward. We have a strong fiscal footing built up over years of careful stewardship by our forefathers. We have a clear plan for the road ahead, anchored on our Forward Singapore agenda. We are grounded in our shared values of solidarity and unity. This year's budget paves the way for us to chart Singapore's next leg, to navigate uncertainties with gumption and strength, to address immediate challenges decisively, and to secure our long-term future with confidence. It is a budget put together by Singaporeans, with Singaporeans, for all Singaporeans. So let us write the next chapter of our Singapore story and move onward together for a better tomorrow. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Pritam Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to Prime Minister and Finance Minister. I assure him that my clarifications won't be with an eye on an election rally. Let me just take 2 points the Prime Minister made in his speech with regard to some points I raised in my speech. First, on the question of climate vouchers for individuals who are private household residences, I think the irony here is the cost of living affects people across the board, including those in private dwellings. And giving them assistance also makes the point that the issue cuts across all segments of society, which was the meta point that I made when I addressed the subject before I made that point. The second issue, Finance Minister, I beg your pardon, Prime Minister asks about where is the turbocharging on the matter of inflation. I took reference from the reply that was given by the government in early 2024. I think it was referred to by Member Saktiandi as well, where the MAS set out a projected number with regard to core inflation for 2024. It was 2.5 to 3.5%. And it assessed, or it estimated that the goods and services tax rate increase would contribute slightly less than 1% to core inflation. So if you take that figure with the lower end of the estimate at 2.5%, that's 40%. And that is the contribution of the GST hike. That's how I read it, hence the term, hence my characterization of turbocharged. On the matter of the third subject, which was covered by the Prime Minister in his roundup speech, if I can just bring back what was mentioned at last year's budget when the then Prime Minister was then Finance Minister brought up in his roundup speech. He said he confirmed that OECD estimated that the investment hubs, Singapore being one of them, would stand to see corporate tax revenue gain ranging from 5 billion to 11 billion, but that on a more conservative estimate, this was 2 billion to 11 billion, and that increases would only materialize from fiscal year 2027. MOF was making assessments and detailed projections and would come back with detailed revenue updates. It has been a year so far. So far, we have not received these updates, and I hope Minister can share with us what these numbers are. In 2023, I think Prime Minister also spoke about, towards the end of his speech, about the occasional papers, and it released, MOF released an occasional paper in 2023 covering medium-term fiscal outlook up to financial year 2030, but that paper did not include corporate income tax revenues that would accrue arising from BEPS. The Finance Minister said also in his last budget reply speech, and I quote, that the occasional paper that we published last year may not be so occasional after all. We will keep on updating it from time to time so that everyone will have a sense of how our fiscal trends are unfolding, not just on a year-to-year basis, but over 5-year and 10-year horizons. Can I confirm that MOF will be releasing this occasional paper on the medium-term outlook with BEPS reflected in its projections shortly? And finally, sir, in the course of our last budget debate as well, I remember a senior PAP backbencher saying that he was surprised, or he was pleasantly surprised actually, that what he had seen only 2-3 weeks earlier in the course of the motion that we had in Parliament on the reserves, he had hoped that our corporate tax collections would overtake NIRC within a 10-year time frame. And merely 2 weeks later, that overtaking had occurred. NIRC became the second top revenue source, and corporate income tax overtook it. And the Prime Minister said that it was not so clear-cut whether that trajectory would continue, and that it was too early to tell whether it can be sustained, so we will continue to monitor. Can I ask the Prime Minister whether there's some clarity now on that point? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
So I thank the Leader of the Opposition for the opportunity to clarify these points. On climate voucher, I should just reiterate, I understand his explanation. I was just making the point that this is not a cost of living support measure, climate vouchers. It's meant to encourage everyone to go for energy efficiency. Members have asked for this, the residents themselves have asked for this, and we think that in the broader scheme of things, it's a move we can make. I mean, Workers' Party is free to object to it if you feel like it's not worth doing, but and if you feel that you don't want to support this, please say so. But we think it's a worthwhile move to make to encourage energy efficiency. On the turbocharging of inflation and the explanation that Mr. Singh provided, I think he would have also, if he had read the reply he cited, read other MAS statements, which stated very clearly the impact of the GST on price levels is once-off, and it is transitory. The impact of inflation is transitory. And the explanation he gave that the impact of GST on inflation, the once-off effect or the transitory effect is high as a proportion of the base inflation actually doesn't make sense, because if I take that view, then I really should be raising GST at a time of very high inflation. Then the proportionate impact would be quite small, because the 1% on a very high inflation base means that there is very little impact. But if that's the case that the Workers' Party feels, then really there should not be any concern about the timing of the GST increase. The third set of questions, they are related, around corporate tax. Let me explain what the situation is. Go back to the beginning of the decade when we started looking at tax revenues. Actually, at that time, there was no certainty at all that corporate income tax would go up, even with BEPS, because remember, the stated objective of BEPS, not even this explicit stated objective, one of it is to transfer and reallocate profits to market jurisdictions, large economies, markets. We are going to be impacted by that very move. We would have profits reallocated from us, and we would be suffering. It has not worked out, or it still hasn't been implemented, this part of BEPS, but that was the beginning, what they wanted to do. That's why we were concerned, and that's why we didn't think that we would be able to get more revenues from corporate income tax. Later on, BEPS evolved and people started talking about having a minimum corporate tax of 15% applied across all countries. Yes, but that didn't mean that competition would disappear and everyone would just operate with a 15% corporate income tax. As I have explained, even with that consensus earlier struck on a minimum corporate income tax, countries were already carving out maneuvering space for themselves to introduce all sorts of different kinds of incentives in order to attract investments. This was the reality that we faced with. So even if the domestic top-up tax yields more revenue, we are very likely to have to also spend more to maintain our competitiveness. Thirdly, the situation today has gotten a lot fuzzier because the US has pulled out of the OECD consensus, and we have no clue at all how this will emerge in the coming years. And that's why it is so difficult to say, give us an updated projection. We don't even know what the global tax arrangement will be like in the next 1-2 years, given the unpredictabilities we face now. Even the Europeans are worried. Where the consensus has frayed. What is going to happen? What is the next move going to be? Will it be more tit-for-tat type taxes, or will there be some global cooperation? It is really unclear. And that's why we are unable to provide any immediate or any updates to our corporate income tax revenues from BEPS in the near term. But certainly, as the situation gets clearer, we remain committed to providing further updates on our medium-term fiscal position, including revenues from BEPS, if any, pluses or minuses, and we will continue to publish these figures. But in the meantime, we are fortunate that even before the domestic top-up tax, the minimum corporate income tax has kicked in, companies have started to do more substantial activities out of Singapore, and our corporate income tax collections have gone up. That's a big plus for us, but as I have explained, it's too early to tell whether this is a lasting trend. But whatever it is, it's good that we are in such a position, and we will make good use of the revenues to ensure that Singaporeans benefit, to ensure that we continue to advance our goals. Next, on the occasional papers, I mentioned it, that we will be committed to publishing and updating them. We are unable to, there are no significant updates that we have been able to make in recent time, given the very complex global situation. That's why we have not updated any, given an update to the OP recently. But as I have said just now, when we get better clarity around our revenue position in particular, we will certainly be committed to providing an update to the OP.
Mr. Leong Eng.
So I have two clarifications for the Prime Minister. Firstly, on the SINGA capitalization of $4.2 billion and $4.6 billion for the two FY. And the PM mentioned this is because of the bond that we issued to fund the infrastructure. And it comes in as part of the fiscal position. So I'd like to ask the Prime Minister whether should we remind Singaporeans that this is actually a sum of money that we need to pay over a period of time through depreciation of the assets? Because it comes in as cash now, and we're able to use it for our current expenditure. We have to remind ourselves that these are amount of money that need to be paid over a period of time, and therefore we should not see it as surplus, as in like a revenue surpluses. So that's my first clarification. Second clarification is last year the PM, then the PM mentioned about the $5 billion that is expected to be spent on the Forward Singapore policy moves as a first installment. And then he also mentioned that close to 40 billion is expected to be spent also on the Forward Singapore policy move by the end of this decade. So I'd like to ask the PM for this FY, what's the estimated amount that's attributable to the second installment of the Forward Singapore policy moves, and whether he anticipates this subsequent installment to be even higher amounts, and whether the 40 billion that was mentioned earlier, is it still the amount to be envisaged that will be spent? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
So I agree with Mr. Liang's first point, because as I said, there is no free lunch. The capitalization of these large projects is the right thing to do for intergenerational equity. It's not to generate near-term fiscal space for us. So we will do more to explain to Singaporeans the treatment of SINGA and why we should not assume that because we are doing this capitalization accounting treatment that there is somehow some additional freebie in the near term that allows us to spend more. That is not the motivation from SINGA. On Forward Singapore expenditures, in last year's budget, we said it was 5 billion. This year, we will probably spend about 5 billion as well. But overall, if you look at the social initiatives that we are putting together, and a lot of the Forward Singapore agenda will be on the social spending, and the chart I showed you just now clearly showed that social spending is rising. So we fully expect more to be spent on this front, on Forward Singapore and on social development. It probably will go beyond $40 billion.
Associate Professor James Lim.
So I appreciate PM's explanation that the progressive wage model is one approach, and indeed perhaps the government's preferred one for uplifting wages at the lower end of the income distribution. But as I said in my speech, where I think the squeeze is felt most acutely is by those in the middle, those who are sandwiched by commitments to their parents and children, but who don't happen to work in one of the 8 sectors that the PWM currently covers. So the first question I have is, what is being done to help these workers realize wage increments that are commensurate both with their contributions to greater productivity and the high cost of living? Related to this, PM emphasized that skills upgrading and retraining is key to elevating nominal wages, and I do not disagree with this in principle. But as I explained in my speech, real wage gains over the past 5 years have not kept up with increases in productivity and the cost of living. So the question that begs to be asked is, how can the government assure Singaporeans who do choose to retrain and reskill and upskill that those efforts will ultimately be rewarded by actual wage increments when the unfettered labor market does not seem to already be doing so?
Prime Minister.
So we are focused not just on the lower wage workers. We are pushing their wages through progressive wages, workfare, and many other initiatives. But we are also focused on the middle income and on the broad middle to ensure that Singaporeans do enjoy continued real wage increases. Generally speaking, we have been able to achieve positive outcomes. I know Associate Professor Lim talked about the last 5 years of data where wages seem to lag behind productivity growth. But you can slice any short-term data over any shorter-term period and look at the lags, or when sometimes wages will be lagging behind, sometimes wages will be ahead of productivity. Certainly in the last 5 years, wages have not caught up with productivity, but if you look at the longer-term time frame, we want to ensure wages do match productivity increases, and it has been so. It has been so, and we will continue to ensure this remains. The best way to do that is to ensure a strong, vibrant economy, but not just leaving it to market forces alone, but to support workers with all the investments we are putting into Skills Future, which is not only benefiting the lower wage workers, but supporting the broad middle of our workforce. And that's why we are redoubling efforts, investing more in every worker through a whole range of incentives and schemes and programs, through working with the NTUC, our brothers and sisters in the labor movement, through the CTC grants, working with enterprises who are prepared to do workforce transformation. We are putting in place all the building blocks that are necessary to strengthen our Skills Future system and to make sure that Singaporeans continue to enjoy sustained real income increases.
Ms. Fumiha.
Thank you, Speaker. I have 2 questions for the Prime Minister. The first question is, with the generous support measures, including the SG60 vouchers, I would like to ask the Prime Minister what impact these measures will have on inflation. The second question is, I think what the Prime Minister spoke about, the uncertain environment globally that is actually unfolding. Actually, that's really real. I would like to ask whether the Prime Minister can indeed elaborate more what would be some of the worst-case scenarios that the government is preparing for, and how we as a nation should prepare ourselves. Thank you.
Prime Minister.
So on inflation, MES certainly will do its assessments in due course. The government will also do the same, but we think it's manageable. As far as the cost of living support package is concerned, this is not new. We have been providing it in previous budgets. In fact, if you look at the overall amount provided for cost of living support in this budget, it is smaller than previous year's budget. Overall amount, not just vouchers alone, right? If you look at the overall amount, it is smaller. And one reason why it is smaller is precisely because inflation has eased, and we think it's correct to taper the overall size of the cost of living support package. But this year, because of SG60, we have a special package to share the fruits of a nation's progress with all Singaporeans. It's once off. It's SG60. It's not going to be year after year. And within the parameters and the amounts that we are giving out through SG60, I think overall there should be a manageable impact on inflation. The second question on worst case scenarios, I mean, there are a whole range of them that we will have to prepare for. As I said, it can go from something as extreme as conflict in Asia, which we have not seen for the most part in decades, but we have to be prepared now. The risk is not insignificant. It has certainly gone up. You have hotspots in our part of the world where accidents, miscalculations can happen, and it will certainly have knock-on impact on sentiment, on confidence, on the whole economy. But you could also have other kinds of emergencies and threats, cybersecurity, pandemics, supply chain disruptions. A whole range of things can happen. And even if they don't happen nearby, within Asia itself, something that happens far away can have knock-on impacts here in Singapore. So we just have to be prepared, brace ourselves for a bumpier ride ahead, but at the same time draw confidence from the fact that our fiscal strength allows us to respond swiftly to any emergency.
Ms. Hazelpua.
First of all, let me clarify that PSP is not displeased with the vouchers because we believe that they will help Singaporeans in the short term, but not over the long term. Now, the Prime Minister has said that he has concrete plans for the future. So can I ask if his plans include plans to lower our high cost of living with measures that have longer term effects rather than vouchers? And secondly, the Prime Minister, in response to questions about CPF investments, asked what happens if a person happened to retire at the point of market downturn. Now, does the Prime Minister not agree that this problem can be managed if we have differentiated rules based on age, like, for example, giving younger CPF members greater leeway in investing in higher risk, higher return instruments, and for older workers to limit their exposure to such investments? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
So I'll take the second question first. Indeed, there are life cycle funds, target date funds, which provides that kind of glide path that Ms. Phua talked about. If you are young, you take higher risk, and then as you get older, the portfolio becomes a sort of a safer portfolio in order to minimize the risk. Actually, these funds are already available in the market. They tend not to be very popular with Singaporeans for some reason, but they are available, and we hope that we can make them more accessible to Singaporeans. But the question that I said just now goes back to not just having choices and options, but whether on a more structured basis, is there some possibility of looking at redesigning or updating the CPF system? And it's even with the kind of glide path target date fund that we talked about, it's not easy to achieve a better outcome across the board on a consistent basis than the risk-free SA rate of 4% and up to 6% with extra interest. It is actually very hard. But anyway, as I highlighted the considerations, we are studying the matter, and we will look further into it. On the earlier question, what are we doing more in terms of structural programs and schemes to help Singaporeans cope with the cost of living? Yes, of course we are. As I mentioned just now, and all that I've said in the roundup speech, the bulk of our government spending is directed towards these structural longer-term programs in education, in skills future, in job training, in upgrading Singaporeans, in ensuring that economy is strong so that Singaporeans earn higher incomes on a consistent basis, but at the same time providing a social support system to provide greater assurances on the basics in life and to make sure that if anyone suffers a setback, we are there to catch them and help them recover stronger. those are the things we are doing. Let's try not to put a wedge between the government and the people. There is no point in saying the government is rich and has strong fiscal position and then painting this as being detrimental to the well-being of Singaporeans. A strong fiscal position for Singapore is not at the expense of Singaporeans. In fact, it benefits Singaporeans in so many ways because we are able to invest more in Singaporeans. We are able to provide them with more support. We are able to help them with so many different areas of life and ensure that everyone benefits from a higher standard of living. It's easy to talk about spending more, sailing closer to the wind. We have so much money, let's just be a bit more cavalier and relaxed about our fiscal rules, don't have to be so tight. But at the end of the day, who bears the price? Who pays the price? If something were to go wrong, if a crisis were to hit, if we end up fiscally weaker as a country, who pays the price? It's not politicians, it's Singaporeans, it's our children and our grandchildren. Let's not gamble with Singaporeans' lives and future.
Ms. Usha Chandradas.
I thank the Prime Minister for his assurance that he will consider my suggestions for the visual arts sector. I also raised a number of questions about how the culture pass is going to be administered. Could I ask if the Prime Minister has a response to those questions? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Sir, I think those specific questions on the culture pass are best answered by the Minister in charge of MCCY at the COS. And I'm sure he will be happy to give a comprehensive response.
Mr. Louis Chua.
Thank you, Speaker. Just one clarification, but a bit of a long one. I mentioned the point about the top-ups to endowment and trust funds, about how just in these 2 years we can set aside close to about 42 billion. I mentioned not in the context of earnings management of companies, but how if you look at in the context of transparency and the matching principle, in the sense that if you look at these top-ups to the funds, they are to meet our spending needs in the future. Similar to how, if you look at our SINGA expenditure, our development expenditures, these are also spending that are meant for longer term needs and purposes. But in the sense that if you have the spending made from the endowment and trust funds, we get a lot less granularity versus the regular expenditures, which, those who go to the budget website can see the whole full heads of expenditure under the different ministries, under different spending categories. So in that context, under the whole premise of greater transparency and the matching of the expenses against the periods in which they are incurred, would the PM be able to share the rationale behind these? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the funds that we've set up are for specific purposes. They are well established. We highlight what they are. And if there is a need for more information on how on the spending and expenditure associated with each of these funds, we will take a look at how we can put up more information.
Are there any more clarifications for Mr. Leong Man Wai?
Mr. Speaker, sir, thank you. At your instruction that I should ask all the questions in one go, and I have a lot of questions, so I've actually waited until the last. If any other members want to raise questions, I would encourage them to raise before me. Okay, I have questions in 3 categories. One, on the budget structure, I have 2 questions. 2, on the NIRC, I have 3 questions. And on public housing, I have 4 questions. On the budget structure, first I want to highlight or want to emphasize that PSP is all for fiscal prudence. However, I think the PM and Finance Minister and the government has always been taking the attitude that the surpluses, the more the merrier. So I want to what I want to say is that surpluses are not always the more the merrier. There must be a balance. So my first question is, the leader of opposition has pointed out that this term of government will have a budget surplus of $14 billion. So I'd like to ask the PM, is the government aiming to run a balanced budget over its term, or as much surpluses as possible? Because we are of the view that surpluses coming from over-taxation and overcharging are the drivers of structural inflation in Singapore. My second question, does the government believe that there's still a need to put back into the reserves for the $40 billion we spent on COVID-19? Because we all know from the statistics, from the data provided by MAS, that we have already accumulated more than $300 billion more in official foreign reserves over the last few years. And some of this has been transferred to the GIC already. So these are the 2 questions for the budget structure.
You can move to your next 3 questions.
Okay. So my next 3 questions is on the NIRC. The government has repeatedly highlighted that NIRC contributes 20% of the budget resources, implying that this money was spent on the current generation of Singaporeans. To determine whether this is actually the case, I would like to ask the following questions. 1, can the PM confirm that indeed, on the average, budget resources equivalent to about 80% of the NIRC every year are being transferred to endowment and trust funds, which will not all be spent in the allocated year, but reported as an expenditure in that year? 2, what is the total assets under the funds as of today? I think it's about $70 or $80 billion, but I would like the PM to confirm. In other words, these are the NIRC that has been allocated to the budgets over the last few years, not spent, and still remaining in the endowment and trust funds. 3rd question, we already have a single framework which can be used to fund important infrastructure like Changi Airport and coastal protection at a much lower cost to the people than raising revenue from GST hikes or COE. So can the government re-examine the need to divert so much resources from the NIRC to endowment and trust funds so that we can redirect these budget resources to fund social spending increases, or to relook at the need for the hike in GST and property tax increases? My last category, Speaker, is on public housing. 4 questions. The PSP has presented the Affordable Home Scheme and Millennial Apartment Scheme as viable solutions to our current housing problems. The government has been criticizing our ideas without much basis because it does not seem to have done research on them. And at the same time, the government is not offering enough explanation as to how it is going to solve the ongoing problems that we are already experiencing today. First question, what is the latest update on the solution for the lease decay problem? Second question, can I ask the PM whether the government has a better solution than AH has to the lease decay problem, which threatens Singaporeans' retirement security because their retirement funds are tied to the value of their flat, which may soon decay for those living in older flats? 3, how is the government going to ensure that the BTO price will stay below $1 million as the land costs continue to increase in line with property price increases? 4, what safeguards do the government have in place if the resale market price collapses in the near future because of the increase in supply from the ramping up of the BTO supply in recent years? And sorry, Speaker, since you say I should ask one more question, as I was going through, there's one more question I want to ask. So this is actually the 10th question. I also like to chip in on the point raised by Leader of Opposition on turbocharging inflation due to GST. I think the information provided by PM is not enough to describe the situation because, one, the ground inflation is actually much more than what is reflected in the statistic. I have lived in Singapore for more than 60 years, and even my personal experience, including the experience in the 70s when I accompanied my mother to go to the community center to buy cheap rice from NTUC. The recent few years, really, I can feel the prices are just going leapfrogging, especially cooked food. Okay, so the ground inflation is different. I think the word turbocharging is not too far from the truth. Secondly, the statistical inflation data that PM has quoted, around 6% in 2022, but when GST was increased, the inflation actually come down, the reported inflation. 2023, 4% around, and 2024, around 3%. But he is an economist, I'm an economist. We know there's such a thing as anticipatory behavior. A lot of the merchants are already raising prices in 2022. So the 6% is a better reflection that people are anticipating that GST is coming. Okay, so combined, anyway, all 3 years we have, more than double-digit increases in inflation. That tells the story better, I think. Sorry for the long, thank you.
It was 9 minutes for you. Prime Minister?
So I will attempt to reply to all the points that have been raised. First, on the budget structure, I think Mr. Leong has mischaracterized the government's position. It's not the bigger the surplus, the merrier. We don't just look at it from that point of view. We adopt a responsible and fiscal prudent approach in budgeting. We are prepared to spend more if there are good ideas. As I said, the issue is not about spending more. The issue is about getting the policies right and making the right decisions to support Singaporeans. And if this entails more spending, we will. As you have seen in our social development spending, it is rising, and I fully expect it to rise further. The issue at hand is really about the approach towards thinking about budgeting. Our approach is one where we recognize that there are fiscal rules. And if there are fiscal rules, let's respect the rules. Let's not just keep thinking about changing the rules the first time we run into trouble and need more money. Let's stay disciplined, operate within these fiscal rules, and if we need more money, we raise the revenues to support and cover the additional spending needs. That's the fundamental approach that we adopt. I think the PSP may have a different approach, and they are fine to have a different approach. But as I say, when we have a care about what you want and how you want to manage our country's finances, you may think it's not a big deal, just spend more, disregard the rules, but step by step, these are sure ways to weaken Singapore fiscally, and when that happens, it's Singaporeans who suffer. The talk about whether we will put back into reserves, I thought I made that clear in my speech. We will not be putting back into the reserves. We will not be able to because we do not expect structural surpluses. We expect to run balanced budgets over the medium term. And whether or not, too many questions. Okay, that answers the first part on the budget structure. Next on NIRC. All the NIRC revenues goes into the consolidated fund, and then we spend from the consolidated fund. Mr. Leong's objection appears to be some of the spending goes into these funds, the so-called endowment, the endowment and trust funds, and that these are not real spending. But that's not the case. As I have tried to explain just now, these are, most of them are drawdown funds. In some instances, like the Changi Airport Fund, we are going to expand and spend the money quite soon when we build T5. In some cases, a bit longer. But certainly, within this generation, we will be spending a lot of that money. So they will be spent, and there are good reasons why we set them aside now in order to spend and make sure that we have the resources we need for these near-term and longer-term expenditures, which will be spent. Mr. Leong says better to fund these projects through SINGA. They are, I think he said, lower cost. Actually, SINGA is not lower cost at all. SINGA costs money. It's just SINGA is a different way of financing because for very large, long asset life projects, we think from an intergenerational equity point of view, it's better to spread it out. And so we have SINGA. So we are going to do both. We're going to have real spending needs, which will be covered through these funds, and we will have projects that are funded by SINGA. That's on the NIRC. And overall, if you look at the revenue moves that we have made, GST, as well as the other revenue changes, tax changes we made in this term of government, as I've explained, we are now in a good fiscal position, but it gives us the ability to move quickly and to do things for Singaporeans. Having this strong fiscal position does not come at the expense of Singaporeans. If you look at the tax burden, if you look at what we impose on taxes, relative to many other advanced economies, our tax burden is in fact quite low. And that's objective data, you just have to compare. And we intend to keep our overall tax burden low. But we will maximize effectiveness from every amount that we spend in order to make sure we maximize the benefits and outcomes for Singaporeans. Finally, thirdly, on public housing, lease decay, what's our solution? The solution is VERS. We have explained the broad outlines of VERS already, and we will provide more details in due course. On BTO flats, how do we ensure affordability? We do so by making sure that the pricing of BTO flats will be done in such a way that Singaporeans will always be able to afford. So that will make, the pricing will have to look at Singaporeans' incomes. And as I illustrated with a concrete example, the BTO price for that particular example has been updated in line with median incomes. So that will be the way we ensure that BTO and HDB will continue to be affordable. Are we worried that we are overbuilding? Here I'm a little puzzled. I thought Mr. Leong and the PSP are worried about not enough flats. And we had this debate with the Workers' Party too a few years ago about are we overbuilding and therefore we're going to have a property market crash. So are we concerned about high prices or are we concerned about the opposite? If we are concerned about high prices, then we need to build more, particularly because we have to catch up with the disruption in supply that happened during the COVID years. And that's what we are doing. We are catching up with supply. And it's because of that disruption in supply that has created that imbalance in the market. And that's exactly why we have to build more now to restore that balance. And as I said just now, we can be assured that we will be able to restore balance because HDB flats are only purchased by Singaporeans. And we will be able to build enough HDB flats for every Singaporean household. Finally, on inflation, that's the last point that Mr. Leong mentioned and how he says the statistics are misleading. Well, or doesn't reflect the reality on the ground. But statistics are what they are. Unless Mr. Leong is accusing the Department of Statistics of not collecting CPI data properly, it may happen in other countries. It certainly doesn't happen in Singapore. We have a proper system of collecting CPI, updating the basket, the inflation basket, and the data is what it is. And I stand by the data. It has come down. There is no basis to say that GST increase has turbocharged inflation, and even the MAS itself, in its assessment, would have reflected that in its monetary policy statements.
Associate Professor James Lim.
Sir, I appreciate your indulgence. Just a quick clarification. PM mentioned earlier on that had there not been a GST increase, we would have run a deficit over the past 2 years. I recall during our debate on the GST that the fiscal hole that would have been met by the GST increase would have been something in the order of 3.7 billion. I understand that last year we ran a very small surplus, but this year we appear to have run a significant surplus. So were GST receipts substantially larger than we expected this year?
Prime Minister.
Sir, I mentioned that we would have been in deficit FY24 and also 25 because of both GST, if we didn't do GST, and the unexpected upside in corporate income tax. So it's both factors, not just GST alone. As I said just in my budget statement, if we were to plan on previous assumptions for corporate income tax, it would be about 3+% of GDP. It's gone up to 4+% of GDP now. And when we plan for budget 2025, we have assumed a higher base. But without that unexpected increase on corporate income tax, without the GST rate increase, certainly FY25, based on whatever we are proposing to spend in the budget, would end up in the deficit.
Mr. Neil Parra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I find it strange that we have spent all this time trying to defend a surplus while most developed economies in the world are begging for a surplus. So I had to stand up and say that. In my view, we have benefited a lot through the reserves that we have had, not just the NIRC, but the fact that we've been able to maintain such high-quality credit ratings, which make people want to lend to us, which make people want to invest in our country, and which make global companies want to come here and pay corporate income tax to us. So I think we should be thankful of where we are. We should be thankful to the preceding generation for putting us where we are, and we should make sure that we keep up the good work that has been done by preceding generations for us and keep on adding to that. I'd also like to add that, and really this is a question for the Prime Minister, corporate income taxes are quite fragile. You know, they are here 1 year, they're gone the next year, largely because of profitability, largely because of the fluidity of capital today. What strategies do we have in place to keep Singapore attractive as we deal with a very complex world where many people are competing for investment dollars, and consequently new projects which can be a source of significant corporate income tax on the revenue side. And on the employment side, obviously, we are investing a lot in Skills Future. But many of the skills that will be needed in a few years, especially because through the advent and the expansion of AI, we don't know as yet. So the fact of the matter is, how do we plan for the unknown, if I may say? And it's a very hard thing to do, but what plans do we have in place other than what we are good at already, which is being nimble? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
So I then thank Mr. Parekh for his comments, especially the point about how we should be appreciative of everything that our forefathers have built and what we have inherited here in Singapore. On the point about how we make our investments sticky, which is really what Mr. Parekh talked about. How do we anchor these investments, recognizing that they have many options and they do have leverage? The multinational enterprises do have leverage. The simple answer and the only answer is that we have to up our game. We cannot just compete on costs. We have to improve our capabilities, offer a value proposition to them. And that's why we are investing in R&D, we are investing in capabilities, we are investing in Singaporean workers, so that the MNEs come here and they see in Singapore an ecosystem which they can plug into and which adds value to their operations. And they will say, look, this is useful, this adds value to me, and I want to do more out of Singapore. That is something we will continue to do. Having good local companies help too, something that Mr. Parekh talked about, because when there are good local companies based here, they supply to the MNEs, they form partnerships with the MNEs, it strengthens the ecosystem, it makes the investments stickier. So that's what we are committed to doing, that's what all the initiatives in the budget seek to do. On Skills Future and training for future skills, it's inherently a very difficult topic. No one can tell what the new requirements of the future are. But I think there are some basics which we can already train for. There are some fundamentals we can train for. And we are doing that. And in designing many of our programs and courses, the course providers, our institutions of higher learning, the partners we work with, don't just design these courses in a vacuum. They often engage industry partners and understand what the latest business trends are, what are the latest requirements, and customize skills programs accordingly. So that's a fundamental approach we take, which hopefully will enable us to be quick, nimble, and to be able to adjust to new and shifting trends.
Mrs. Opa.
I wish to make another pitch to the Prime Minister to consider measures to lower cost of living. Does he not agree that if we lower cost of living, it will benefit all Singaporeans? Whereas if we take the approach of investing in education and training to raise wages, then not everybody can benefit from that, especially older Singaporeans and retirees. Sorry, second clarification. Since the Prime Minister mentioned that our CPI is collected correctly, can I ask how our CPI calculations takes into account shrinkflation? That means the price may remain the same, but the portion is smaller. Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Sir, it's not as though we are doing nothing to manage cost of living pressures. I mean, we talk about some of the big items of cost of living. What are they? Housing is one of them, which we have discussed, and I've described exactly how we are helping to manage cost of living pressures precisely by pricing the BTO flat, different from what's in the resale market, with growing subsidies precisely to keep it affordable for Singaporeans. Our approach is, let's get the pricing right, because if you don't get the pricing right, basically you're giving a subsidy. Somebody's got to pay. We get the pricing right. Then we will subsidize where there is a need to, and we have, on housing, for example. We can debate how much subsidies is correct, but we are, and we are doing more. And so all of the measures that we are doing, it's not just about equipping, training, empowering Singaporeans with skills to get better incomes. It's also to strengthen our safety nets. It's to make sure Singaporeans are able to afford the basics, be it healthcare, retirement, or housing and education. And it's to make sure that we are able to help those who suffer setbacks and enable them to recover and bounce back stronger. On CPI, the DAWS has its methodologies. Shrinkflation is a different matter. I think there are different ways in which we can address that. Mr. Melvin mentioned some of that through price khaki and also through maybe getting retailers to put out unit prices. And so these are some measures we can think about, but it's a constant battle to make sure that we ensure Singaporeans have the ability to cope with cost pressures which we know exist. So we recognize the concerns are real, and that's why, setting aside the headline statistics, setting aside the fact that inflation, CPI inflation is easing, we do recognize that there are real concerns because Singaporeans have to adjust to new price realities. And that's why we are doing more to help them through cost of living support. That's why we are doing more to make sure that Singaporeans will have enough in this budget to address their concerns on cost of living.
Mr. Leong Manoi.
Mr. Speaker, sir, first of all, I must commend Prime Minister for impressively answering my 10 questions. Although I have said that, one shot giving out 10 questions is unfair for the person who is replying to me. I have a few more questions arising, clarification arising from what he has replied just now. First of all, I think the difference between PSP and PAP is that I think PSP prefers to put more money into the pocket of Singaporeans. Government can reduce some expenditures, but also reduce the taxes. So my first question is, can the Prime Minister still answer my question as to what is the total amount of assets that are now being kept under the endowment and trust fund? Then next question on public housing. Can the VERS be a solution anymore? Because the lease decay itself has already set in, as demonstrated in the Ang Mo Kio SIRS case. The economics of SIRS has totally changed as a result of the lease decay. And so we have expected that the same economics will be applied to VERS. Given the economics have changed, will VERS continue to be a viable solution? Anyway, the government owes Singaporeans a clear answer. Since my housing motion, when the government promised to update us on VERS, it is more than 2 years already. And the lease decay problem has surfaced more than 7 years. Till today, there's no clear answer about lease decay. The next question, is it possible that without introducing the prime and the plus schemes, the BTO price would have already gone above $1 million? And the government is using the prime and the plus schemes to slow down the increase to $1 million, but on the other hand, increasing the deficit, the HDB deficit, which in turn increases the burden on the budget. That is something that's not sustainable. Last question. On whether the supply, the ramp up of this BTO supply now will eventually lead to an adjustment of the resale market. Actually, PSP's stance has always been, we are not in favor of just ramping up the supply. We have said in our housing motion that we should also increase the supply of quality rental flats so that this does not become a supply on the hand of owners, but it's a rental flat supply. Because if we increase the number of owners owning flats, then there will be a point where all the Singaporeans have owned flats already. And the next thing will be a downward adjustment in our HDB prices. Okay, so my last question is, will we reach a point when Singaporeans are faced with no choice but to increase our population faster to $10 million in order to arrest the decline in our HDB price? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Sir, I would disagree with Mr. Leong's characterization of the PAP government's policy as refraining or denying Singaporeans from funding or keeping the funds and not leaving it in the pockets of Singaporeans, as he put it. That's not the case at all. Whatever we collect, we put it back to benefit Singapore and Singaporeans directly. That's what the budget is about. It's not about the government holding back something. It's about making sure that all that we collect goes back to Singaporeans in different ways. Some, of course, are direct transfers, but not all of it. After all, the PSP itself says that you shouldn't do so much because this will create entitlement. So yes, some part of it goes into direct transfers, short-term measures, but a lot of it goes into a whole range of different programs which benefit Singaporeans. We are putting back the funds to benefit all Singaporeans. That is our approach. On the size of the endowment trust funds, I don't have the figures offhand. We can deal with that separately in the COS or in a separate PQ. On VERS, yes, we know that it is something outstanding, and we will provide details because the first flat for VERS is not due anytime soon, but eventually the time will come when we have to do VERS, and as we approach that date, we will certainly provide more details. The issue around plus and prime flats, let's be very clear. Why did we have to do plus and prime flats? Because for standard flats, we know that the resale market moves up and down in the near term, but we will price the BTO flats not based on resale market alone, but we look at incomes and price for affordability. So there is a subsidy there. But if we apply that same subsidy to localized popular areas, the flats will be more unaffordable. And can we make the subsidy more? Well, we can, but then you have a problem where there will be a lottery effect. People will immediately know the subsidy is greater in these popular areas. Let's go for that. And when I win the BTO, I strike lottery, right? And that's not good, that's not equitable. So the right thing to do is to have a plus and prime framework where we provide more subsidies in order to bring down the headline price, make it affordable, but at the same time, when the person sells a flat, the additional subsidies is returned to HDB. I think that's a fair and equitable way, and that's why we have the plus and prime framework. Rental flats, I mean, we want to have home ownership for all Singaporeans. That has always been a policy. That's what Singaporeans want, and I think that gives every Singaporean a stake in our nation's success. So we will continue with home ownership. It has been the foundation of Singapore society, the foundation of Singapore's success, and I think it continues to be a very important key pillar for nation building. We want to ensure a nation of homeowners, and we will continue to fine-tune and improve HDB policies to make sure that every Singaporean who wants to can own their own homes.
Mr. Leong, one final one. Okay. And just get straight to your clarification.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I hope it's not an old clarification, a repeated clarification.
Yeah, I just want to clarify one last point with the Prime Minister. He didn't really quite answer my question. So without the Prime and Plus scheme, do you agree that our BTO price in certain areas would have gone above the $1 million already?
Prime Minister.
That's hypothetical, I wouldn't know, but let's put it this way. When my parents bought their Marine Parade flat in the 1970s, it was $30,000 or $30,000 plus. At that time, would they ever imagine that they could sell the flat for $500,000 in the 90s? No, not at all. But why have flats gone up? It's because of incomes. It's because Singapore has succeeded. It's because our standards of living have gone up. And that progress, that success, has benefited every homeowner in Singapore. That's what home ownership provides. A concrete stake in our nation's progress, and not just that, but eventually a home and a nest egg which you can tap on for retirement. It's a sound and a key pillar of our social compact, which will continue to improve and enhance and build upon.
Ms. Hazelpur.
One last clarification. When would the government be able to let us know the details of VERS? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
I don't have the answer now, but you can ask the Minister for National Development at the COS, and I'm sure he will give you a response.
The question is that Parliament approves the financial policy of the government for the financial year 1st April 2025 to 31st March 2026. Those who agree say aye. Aye. Those who disagree say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. We have completed the debate on the budget statement. I propose to take a break now and we'll resume sitting at 2:55 p.m. I have revised, hang on. I know we are all hungry and tired. I have revised the commencement time of the Committee of Supply with the change in commencement time to start our Committee of Supply at 2:55 p.m. The revised bulletin time for Head U, Prime Minister's Office, is 5:45 p.m. Honourable members will be notified of the revised conclusion times for the subsequent heads of expenditure. Order, order.